I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics. Messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for March the 10th, 2026. On our theology roundup, we've been going through a series, The Nations Streaming to Zion in the End Times, looking at Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4. Today, this short series concludes by addressing the words of the prophets, because one of the most important statements which appears in the apostolic writings or the New Testament is Acts 15:15. Some of you all remember the Jerusalem Council debate. They need to be circumcised in order to keep the law to be saved. Speaking of the non-Jewish believers coming to faith, Peter said, no, we're all saved through the grace of the Lord Yeshua. And James the Just got up and said that the words of the prophets were in the midst of fulfillment, specifically quoting from Amos 9, 11, and 12 from the Septuagint. But words and prophets are in the plural. So what else could James have had in mind? And among the various possibilities proposed by biblical examiners definitely involve Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4. So we're going to reflect on this specifically as we consider what is happening in today's Messianic congregations and synagogues, non-Jewish believers being directed, summoned, called, superintended by the Lord into embracing outward things of Torah. Does that involve the fulfillment of some of these prophecies? That is not a discussion we have as frequently as we should. So, if you will, please turn with me to the Messianic Apologetics website, click on the Articles tab, go down all the way to the letter T and almost to the letter U, and here's the article we've been going through. The Torah will go forth from Zion. Click there, and a PDF file will open up, and this is where we left off yesterday with the words of the prophets. According to Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4, God's law is supposed to supernaturally go forth. I would submit that given the original circumstances surrounding the assembling of the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council, that these were among the prophecies in the mind of James the Just when he issued his decree regarding the new non-Jewish believers who were coming to faith in Yeshua. These people did not need to be ordered, Acts 15:5, English Standard Version, to follow the Torah, as insisted upon by some of the hyper-conservative Pharisees. James instead acknowledged how the words of the prophets, Acts 15:15, were to be allowed to take shape. Why rigidly or forcibly insist that these new believers were to follow the law when the prophets anticipated the nations coming to Zion to be taught by it? Would it not be better to see such an expectation take place as it was sovereignly decreed by God? Rather than insisting that these new believers be circumcised as Jewish proselytes, James issued 4 non-negotiable requirements for them to enter into the ecclesia. The apostolic decree of Acts 15:20, 29, when followed, would see the new non-Jewish believers effectively cut off from their previous social circles in Greco-Roman paganism, making their new social circles communities of Jewish Messiah followers and the wider Jewish population. Given the natural fulfillment of prophecy and not meddling mortals forcing things, the non-Jewish believers would find themselves participating in what was anticipated by words such as Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4. The responsibility of the Jewish believers was to welcome them into the community of faith as fellow brothers and sisters, facilitating an environment where they could be mentored and discipled in God's word, and above all, loved. The key emphasis of Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4, is that the teaching of God's Torah to the nations will bring forth great peace. Is there at all implied within this prophecy the idea that the nations, in being taught from the Torah, will adhere to many of the same commandments as Israel proper, or only those things which would be directly concerned with peace, love, and mercy? Would going to Zion to be taught from God's Torah imply that the nations, in being instructed, would find themselves observing things like the seventh day Sabbath, Shabbat, the appointed times or Moedim, or eating kosher? Were directions like these only intended for ethnic Israelites, or useful directions for all who look to Israel's God for hope and salvation? Noting the opinion of David Kimke, or Radak, 1160 to 1235, I.W. Zlotke considers the Torah the nations will hear to be, quote, religious and moral instruction, unquote. This seems to imply that the training they will receive will be more encompassing than just ethical and moral matters. It can hardly be overlooked, among the many examples to be considered, how in the future millennium all people on earth will be observing the seventh day Sabbath. Isaiah 66:23. The oracle of Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4 is obviously most concerned with the nations being properly instructed in their ethics and morality, beginning with casting aside their weapons of war. At the same time, though, its message is rooted within the fact that faithful Israelites were to go up to Zion several times each year during the Moedim or appointed times, Leviticus 23 et al., and such Israelites would go there to be similarly taught the main ethical responsibilities involved with Moses' teaching. Leslie C. Allen indicates, quote, year by year, bands of pilgrims would make their way to Jerusalem to engage in festive worship, in the course of which they would receive instruction in the moral traditions of the covenant. This Israelite pilgrimage is here magnified to universal dimensions. Not merely Israel, but their pagan neighbors from all around would one day will there learn lessons which would put into practice back in their own communities, unquote. The message of the apostolic scriptures is that all of God's people make up a kingdom entity known as the Commonwealth of Israel, Ephesians 2:11 through 13, which is to acknowledge Yeshua as Messiah, honor the Torah as a positive result of his redemptive work, Romans 8:3 and 4, and with all persons functioning in mutual submission to one another, Ephesians 5:21, Philippians 2:3 and 4. All three of these principles joined together is not frequently heard in today's Messianic movement, but it forms the thrust of what it truly means for born again believers to truly make up the one new humanity, Ephesians 2:15, the Lord wants to see emerge. Nowhere in the Bible do we ever see the implication that the kingdom of Israel is to remain an exclusively Jewish entity, as the tabernacle of David is to be rightly recognized as an enlarged kingdom realm of Israel, welcoming in the righteous from the nations. Acts 15:15 through 18, Amos 9:11 and 12. But, even if true, we never see the Jewish people replaced as unimportant, as they do indeed have an irrevocable calling to be honored and respected. Romans 11:29, also 3:2. Looking at Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4, the need for the nations to submit to Moses' teaching cannot be denied, as it will truly and ultimately result in worldwide shalom. In Webb's estimation, quote, peace on any other terms is a cruel delusion, a truth we need to bear in mind constantly as we seek to be faithful to God's word in our own modern world of religious pluralism, unquote. There are, in fact, serious consequences to those who will not desire to be instructed by the Lord, as Micah declared. I will root out your Asherim from among you and destroy your cities. Micah 5:14, New American Standard. No leader or teacher wants to be responsible for failing to instruct any one of God's people in what it means to live properly from his word, resulting in them having to suffer either some kind of temporary chastisement or worse, eternal punishment. Yeshua's statement of Matthew 5:19 is useful to remember here. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, this one shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Tree of Life version. What does it mean for the Torah to go forth? And we're going to close up with this. The importance of Micah 4:1-3 and Isaiah 2:2-4 is something which is witnessed every Shabbat in the liturgy of the Jewish synagogue. Far be it from Torah being declared just being some vague instruction, the pronouncement, Torah shall come from Zion, the word of Adonai from Jerusalem, is made right at the point when the Torah scroll is brought forth from the ark. Ehud ben Zvi only confirms, quote, in Jewish liturgy, this portion of Micah 4:2 is read when the Torah scroll is taken out of the ark to be read, unquote. After this, then the Sefer Torah is unrolled and the weekly parashah is canted to the congregation. While this tradition connects Jews to their past before modern printing and books, the expectation that the law will go forth to the nations from Zion is something largely futuristic. The same liturgy is often repeated in today's Messianic Jewish congregations as well. But as speaking it over and over again becomes so rote that not enough have a grasp on its significant prophetic implications, taking place right before us in our day. There is an eschatological expectation witnessed in the prophets that the Torah will go forth from Zion with the nations streaming to hear it. How does this affect the purpose and mission of today's Messianic movement and the role it is to play in the wider world? How are we to capture as much of the expectation of Micah 4:1-3 and Isaiah 2:2-4 in our service for God's kingdom now, before Yeshua returns? This prophetic oracle very much anticipates how the separation of the nations at Babel, Genesis 11:1-9, will be reversed. All nations and peoples will worship the one God of Israel. They will be taught from his law, and true world peace will prevail. The Torah, while originally given to Israel, is something which is to not just affect Israel proper, but the whole world. Because as R.L. Smith observes, quote, Israel did not live in a vacuum, unquote. We should expect Micah 4:1-3 and Isaiah 2:2-4 to take on some significant fulfillment in the future. But given the apostolic scriptures' common emphasis of a realized eschatology, of believers living and experiencing the life of the age to come now, before it is fully manifest, Galatians 1:4, much of what has been foretold can already be enacted. The last days are a stage in history which started 2 millennia ago with the first coming of the Messiah. Acts 2:17, Hebrews 1:2, although more is undoubtedly to be expected. Throughout history, faithful Christians have frequently looked to Micah 4:1-3 and Isaiah 2:2-4 to emphasize the word as the gospel going forth to the world, and born-again believers possessing peace in their hearts via the salvation they cherish in Jesus Christ. Although with this have been those who have truly thought that the proclamation of the good news is to be attended with some kind of proclamation from God's law as a matter of proper conduct for the redeemed. James Limburg describes, quote, "In the future here envisioned, the word of the Lord will go forth from Mount Zion, and it will be for all peoples and strong nations. This Torah is not simply head knowledge, a body of dogma or doctrine. It is instruction, a word from the Lord, which calls for a response, resulting in a new way of living for those who hear it. Here described as walking in his paths." Unquote. Understanding the value of God's Torah begins with comprehending how it is to bring peace to his people. Even while some Messianics may criticize Christians today who widely cast aside the law of Moses, there have been influential Protestant traditions in history, Calvinism, Wesleyanism, which have always upheld the law as a source of piety and morality. They have expelled more concentrated effort to see the thrust of Micah 4, 1 through 3 and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4 realized in the lives of people than perhaps anyone else since the first century has. This is manifested not only in seeing people saved from sins, but also in wanting to help one's fellow human beings via various good works, i.e., building hospitals, orphanages, schools, homeless shelters, relief missions. Today's Messianic people stand in their debt and have the responsibility to continue their positive work, especially now in reaching out to the Jewish people who do not yet know Yeshua. Most importantly, the oracle of Micah 4, 1 through 3 and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4 can only be fulfilled if an environment of peace can be created by leaders and teachers within the body of Messiah. Sadly, this is one area which is not accomplished too well by a number of today's Messianics. But even more so, various quote unquote Torah teachers in the independent Hebrew or Hebraic roots movement are among some of the most likely, in fact, to cause unnecessary divisions and discord. Those who promote some degree of a restoration of Torah are not always associated with a great, sizable message on how born-again believers are to be about restoring human wholeness. Micah 4, 6 through 8 specified some of the disenfranchised groups who are to be immediately affected by Moses' teaching going forth to the world. In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather the outcasts, even those whom I have afflicted. I will make the lame a remnant and the outcasts a strong nation, and the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from now on and forever. As for you, tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you it will come, even the former dominion will come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem. Micah 4, 6 through 8, New American Standard. If the restoration of Torah one hears so much about is not concerned with serving the needs of the lame and downtrodden more than other areas of obedience, then what does that say? Gary V. Smith is right to emphasize, quote, the goal of God's teaching is the practical direction of people's lives. His powerful presence and persuasive message will transform the thinking and behavior of millions in the last days, unquote. I believe that today's Messianic movement surely does possess the potential to make such a difference, but that it will require the implementation of some significant changes in how we think and act. While much more could be said on the changes our faith community needs to make, when I read Micah 4, 1 through 3 and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4, what immediately strikes me is how Yeshua emphasized, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Matthew 5, 9, New American Standard. If the Torah is to be declared to the nations and is to result in peace, then anyone teaching it is to be a diligent peacemaker, wanting all to experience divine blessing and harmony in their lives. Teachers are to desire the full realization of the Aaronic benediction, Numbers 6, 24 to 26, brought about by the indwelling presence of the Spirit, John 14, 17, which can only result in people being edified. Romans 12:18, 14:19. When this becomes our vision for spiritual service, then we will truly make the sizable difference the Lord wants us to make, culminating in the return of Yeshua and his kingdom of total shalom. In seeing the Torah go forth to the world, let us truly anticipate and look forward to the Messiah's reign of peace. Let this prophetic word be as common to us as it was to the generations of Micah and Isaiah. And for certain, questions continue to be asked. What is it with all of these non-Jewish believers coming into the Messianic movement? For someone like me, a prophetic word like Micah 4:1-3, Isaiah 2:2-4 is the place to start. Many people don't know what to do. But I think that this is the best answer from the scriptures, and it is sure as heck a much better answer than one law for the native and the sojourner, which, as we discussed a number of weeks ago, has been cherry-picked, out of context, misapplied, and has been responsible for a huge amount of legalism, inflexibility, and judgmentalism. Whereas this word, the nations streaming to Zion in the end times, that is something which is to emphasize peace. It's to emphasize the final reign of the Messiah, and it's to bring help to those who are helpless. And so it's very easy to connect this word not just to the words of the prophets referred to in Acts 15:15, but the emphasis on the new covenant, a new heart, a new mind, being filled up with God's Spirit, and being set on the right course of discipleship, instruction, transformation, and holiness. All right, now this wraps up this, short mini series on the nation streaming to Zion and the end times. I hope it was something you found very helpful and very encouraging. Now, along with that, we're going to shift to tomorrow and Thursday, and we're going to review something which I wrote a few years ago for Outreach Israel News, and then later it was incorporated into the updated Messianic Torah Helper publication. And that is the analysis sorting through native, sojourner, and God's people today. So we did about 3 weeks going through one law, one Torah theology, a lot of the issues I have with it, but I'm not turning anybody away from doing these things. We do them ourselves. Micah 4:1-3, Isaiah 2:2-4. That's the kind of passage we have to focus our attention on. So I think you're probably ready to, as we are modern Bible readers living in the 21st century, living in a post-resurrection era, where the most important event to us is the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah. How do we sort through the native in the Torah, the sojourner in the Torah, and God's people today? So this will help us hopefully sort through that simple yet complicated rule of biblical interpretation. What did a text mean for its original audience first, and how do we deduce modern principles and application for today? So we're going to go through that Wednesday and Thursday. All right, now let's move on to our news roundup. And of course, we do the news roundup after the theology roundup because the news is time sensitive and it changes from day to day. So when people in the future go and look at this episode, they're going to look at this episode because of the nation streaming to Zion, words of the prophets, not necessarily the news roundup. Now, right now, because of Operation Epic Fury, Operation Roaring Lion, the news changes literally from hour to hour as we monitor and keep tabs on the situation in Iran. That's not the only area of news of importance, but for right now, it's the main area. Number one, we need to be praying for peace. Israel, Gaza, the Middle East, Iran. and most especially protection for all of the believers, the Messianic Jewish community, the underground Christian community. And we need to, of course, pray that they all have an experience with the risen Yeshua. Number two, we do continue to pray for peace, Russia and Ukraine. And number three, for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front, the Western Hemisphere, and all the changes which are taking place here, and things which a lot of people, especially in the Messianic community, and I mean this with all the love and respect in the world, are not necessarily paying attention to. Okay, so all the news stories I'm about to go through, these will be available for you to look at later today when this episode is archived at messianicapologetics.net. That's where you can read the news articles in their entirety, watch the different clips, etc. Okay, our first news story. This is from Open Source Intel yesterday, 12:02 p.m. So I got it after we concluded. 51-second clip. Iran struck Turkey with a ballistic missile. Erdogan, Iran's miscalculation in targeting us has caused deep wounds between the two countries. And Open Source's observation is that this is not good. Now, I know that, and this is an important prompt for us to consider, if we look at what is taking place right now in Iran, the possible end of the Islamic Republic, that is not going to mean the total end of Islamic extremism. It's not going to mean the total end of terrorism or anything like that. And I know that there's some people, especially those who believe in an Islamic beast, they look to Turkey's ambitions of wanting to revive the Ottoman sphere of influence, and we just take a note of that from this. We know right now that the situation changes from hour to hour. And how smart are the people who are in charge of the Islamic Republic of Iran? Who is actually in charge right now? Okay, here's a very important story from 2C TV yesterday at 11:30 a.m. I got it later, obviously. Breaking: President Trump confirms after pressuring Prime Minister Albanese, that's Anthony Albanese of Australia. Australia is now saving the Iranian women's football team. 5 already escaped IRGC officers, more joining them for asylum. A few decided to go back due to threats against their families in Iran. Now, people, and this is not the first time, people defect from one country to another all the time. This is not the first time we've reported on someone from the Islamic Republic defecting to the West. But the most important thing to keep in mind here, when you're talking about the women's football team, that soccer team, obviously, basically, most of them defecting, but a few thinking they need to go back because of threats against their families, threats of retaliation. That is a good barometer regarding how many people in Iran actually support the current government. Because if regime change is something that the West, that Israel wants to truly see in Iran, it's got to come from the people of Iran ultimately. It can't just come because, well, our government, the West doesn't like you. We're going to go in, we're going to take out your leader, and we're going to leave you with what? Question mark. All right, from Newsmax, and I know this is not the first time we've reported on this, you've heard about this. It's from yesterday, March the 9th. U.S. intercepts Iranian message that may activate sleeper cells. U.S. intelligence officials have intercepted encrypted communications believed to have originated in Iran that could serve as an operational trigger for sleeper cells operating abroad, according to a federal alert issued to law enforcement agencies. And you can, of course, read more on that. Of course, over the weekend, there were 2 issues. One, I saw during my Shabbat service Saturday morning, Southwest Airlines flight flying from Fort Lauderdale to Nashville, Tennessee. It had to divert to Atlanta, and then the Kansas City airport being shut down for a while. And even today, I got an alert, as part of the local Dallas news, that it's being recommended between TSA shortages and a security situation that you show up to the airport more than 2 hours. In fact, some are saying you show up to the airport, 5 hours before your flight. So, yeah, this conflict is affecting everyone. And it should go without saying that, you need to keep your eyes on your surroundings, be aware of, possible suspicions. Of course, pray for wisdom, pray for discernment, but it's not, we're not in a usual situation right now. I remember the first time I had to experience some of this. I was 10 years old. It was 1991, January. My late father had gone overseas, gone to India for 3.5 weeks with a Christian group, obviously. And during that time, that's when Desert Storm had started. And this was still at the time when people could go into the actual airport terminal, at least here in the United States. We could go to the gate. We could, take people to the gate. We could meet them at the gate. That ended after 9/11. But that was the first time I experienced something like this. And a lot of people now, they're going to be inconvenienced. It's a lot of it is for your safety, but we have to be smart regarding our surroundings. We just can't, put our head in our phones. Ooh. We have to look around. We got to be smart, whether it's at the airport, whether it's at the supermarket, whether it's wherever it is in the marketplace. And that is unfortunately just the world in which we live. But we also pray that any potential problems never happen. Okay. Also, along with this, ABC News from yesterday, Iran may be activating sleeper cells in other countries, according to a federal government alert sent to law enforcement agencies. So this is another story which goes into this. And certainly, with that said, along with potential threats at airports, places of business, what about your local Messianic congregation or synagogue? Most Messianic congregations have some kind of a security team. When you go to your Messianic congregation, are you looking out at who's coming through the door? Who's visiting? I've never seen that person before. What are they doing here? All of us have a responsibility to facilitate a safe and secure environment. Don't think that it's just to be pawned off on the leadership. And that's not to fearmonger. Certainly, if you are a parent, if you're a mother, a father, a wife, a husband, you're supposed to be looking out for the safety of your children, right? You're supposed to be looking out for the safety of your loved ones. Okay, here's a post from Awesome Jew on X. I referenced this yesterday. This has got a lot of publicity all over social media. A lot of people are acknowledging that some of these individuals, Tucker Carlson, even Megyn Kelly now, they're going in a very bad direction. This is 1 minute, 51 second clip. Tucker Carlson is now claiming that Mark Levin is essentially using witchcraft to create truth by simply speaking, and that Mike Huckabee is under some kind of spell that's causing him to support Israel. Now, I absolutely encourage critical thinking. I encourage people to ask good, intelligent questions. And, when you first see this clip, you're going to see Tucker Carlson rightfully raise the point, well, if you repeat something long enough and loud enough, people will accept it as truth. And I can definitely say that in the world of theology, that can unfortunately be the case, especially with false teachings, but also with underdeveloped teachings. Like, what did we go through a couple of weeks ago? One law for the native and sojourner. And how many of us have seen that repeated over and over and over again, especially on a meme? But time out. Okay, that is an important principle of Torah jurisprudence, but what does it mean in the context of specific passages? And while it does emphasize commonality, and it does emphasize in specific places that a sojourner who had entered into ancient Israel was not to be taken advantage of, and it was to be treated equally along with the native. That was not speaking of universal Torah there. Later, of course, we see that all the community of Israel, this is in Deuteronomy 31, were to receive universal education in God's Torah, but not in those places. So I agree with Tucker Carlson that you repeat something enough, people will believe it. Now, he, in this case, is applying it to support for Israel. And some of these claims that they're under the influence, people like Mark Levin, Mike Huckabee, sooner or later, I am going to be accused of being some shill for the state of Israel. Anybody who comes out and supports the state of Israel is going to be accused of that by somebody at some point. Take note of this. Take note of this, because I know just a few years ago, many of us were following Tucker Carlson. We thought he was pretty solid. Likewise, we're following Megyn Kelly. We thought she was pretty solid. Oh, we'd have disagreements, but we didn't ever expect them to go down some of the paths they're going now. And some of that has to do with the fact that they're no longer working for a big network with millions of dollars. They got to drum up their own support. And guess what? Sensationalism and bullshit sell. That is a fact. And what kind of bullshit have they embraced? Some of the classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. All right, our next story, and this is from X. I just thought it was important to pass this along and make a few observations. This is from the channel of Aaron McIntyre, who, referring to John Elder, who says, if your pastor isn't teaching that the rapture is real, a third temple will be built in Jerusalem, the tribulation is a real event, that there will be a 1,000-year reign under Jesus on earth, then you need to find a new church. And generally speaking, most people in the Messianic community would be found to believe some form of this. Now, they might not be adherents of a pre-tribulation rapture, and they might concede that a third temple may not need to be built. Some kind of tabernacle would suffice. But generally speaking, they're premillennial, and they believe some form of this with a number of modifications. But here, McIntyre says, excuse me, like many evangelicals, this is the eschatology I grew up with, though I got more of it from the Left Behind books and talk radio than I did from the pulpit. But it's a thoroughly modern product and not what most Christians believe throughout history. If you choose to embrace it, that's fine. I'm certainly no theologian, but attacking other Christians for not embracing a 170-year-old retcon of church doctrine is unwise. Now, in this case, he is referring to how the historic position throughout a great deal of Christian history has either been postmillennial or amillennial. You see very early on, and we're going to note this in just a moment, by the early second century, but certainly mid to late second century, supersessionism, replacement theology, church is the new Israel, it took hold among a majority of Christians. You will find, particularly in the works of Irenaeus, a premillennial a premillennial scenario where there'd be a reconstituted, regathered Israel, certainly a tribulation period, and then a literal 1,000 years. But historically, throughout a great deal of Christian history, it's been either amillennial or postmillennial, and the church is the new Israel. And so this idea that Israel would be reconstituted back to the Holy Land, there'd be a rebuilt temple of some kind, and then a 1,000-year millennium. Many are seen to now dismiss that completely as a product of dispensationalism. And it has been well documented that there have been plenty of people who are not dispensational throughout Christian history who have believed in some kind of futuristic end time scenario. The ethnic descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob return back to the Holy Land, and along with that, a third temple and future 1,000 years led by a returned Messiah in person. But we're going to hear more and more that that's not the historic Christian position, and the church is the new Israel. And what are we going to do about that? In our post-October the 7th world, we are seeing a not progression, toward more supporting Israel, standing with the Jewish people, standing against anti-Semitism. We're seeing a reversion back to the way things were a century ago, 2 centuries ago, 3 centuries ago, back before the Protestant Reformation. And that should deeply concern us. All right, from 2C TV, yesterday, 2:33 p.m., and there's a 2-minute, 54-second clip. Strikes continue across Tehran and Isfahan as Israeli operations against IRGC targets expand. Now, this is what you have to take note of. The regime's new supreme leader, reportedly wounded, has still not delivered the national address promised earlier today. And as of now, we still haven't really seen anything. Officials warn the campaign is far from over. Yes, even though Ali Khamenei's son has apparently been elected as the new Ayatollah, haven't really seen much of him. And so that is begging a lot of questions as to his disposition. Now, do I personally believe he is dead? No. But there are a lot of rumors that he's gravely wounded. It's just rumors. But what we have to take from all of this in broad strokes is the pulse of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's what we really have to take from this. Okay, 2C here, next story. This is from 2:42 p.m., and there's a 3-minute, 39-second clip. 5 members of Iran's women's national football team have reportedly defected in Australia after escaping IRGC handlers accompanying the squad. Additional players are now expected to receive protection after international pressure mounted. The situation highlights the risks many Iranian athletes face. And indeed, along with that, just the people in general. But when you have, many members of the national women's football, i.e. soccer team, defecting, what does that tell you about the condition of the average Iranian? Many, I'm sure, if they could escape, they would. But these are the people who are going to welcome regime change when the time comes. Okay, from the Epoch Times yesterday, March the 9th, the headline, Trump says war in Iran is very complete, far ahead of schedule. Okay. And obviously, we as civilians only are getting so much information regarding the Operation Epic Fury or Operation Roaring Lion from the Israeli side. But at least according to the president, as of yesterday, things are ahead of schedule. And you have got to believe that this is something which has been in the planning stages for quite some time. Actually, I'm sure various levels of it have been in the planning stages since the revolution of 1979. Okay, from Visegrad 24. And once again, from the president, this is from 4:17 p.m. yesterday, and there is a 14-second clip. Trump, we took a little excursion to Iran because we felt we had to do that to get rid of some evil. And I think you'll see it's going to be a short-term excursion. Now, we're about a week and a half or so into Epic Fury. Of course, some people who are monitoring this very closely, they go hour to hour. I try to just look at some of the big broad strokes of what is happening. But yes, we got to be paying attention to this. And look, the removal of the Islamic Republic of Iran does not mean that Islamicism, Islamic extremism is going away. It doesn't mean terrorism is going away. It means that a huge hub of these things might go away, but things will reshift and the dust will settle and we'll then begin to focus on some other country in all probability. Okay. Our next story, and this is from the Jerusalem Post. This is actually a very good thing for you to look at. This is from yesterday. Meet the Jews who played pivotal roles in American history. The byline, Jews have played pivotal roles throughout key moments in American history. Excuse me, throughout 2026, monthly online conversations with Jewish historians will journey across American and Jewish history. And of course, most importantly with this is it opens up with Most Americans know that in the midst of the Revolutionary War, the 13 American colonies declared their independence from Great Britain on July the 4th, 1776. But far fewer are aware that Jews were directly involved with the American Revolution. Not only did Jews help finance the Patriot effort, as in the case of Chaim Solomon, known as the financial hero of the American Revolution, some 100 Jews also fought in the war, participating in battles at Valley Forge, Bunker Hill, and beyond. Okay, now this is the reason an article like this is important to keep in mind. On the Christian nationalist side, and I have seen a lot of people go in that direction. You see some of the posts coming out of channels like Smash Balls, people like Joel Webbin, various others. They believe that in a quote unquote Christian America, okay, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, yeah, they'd be made illegal. But what about Judaism? Judaism and the synagogue would be made illegal as well. Well, and that, of course, attempts to rewrite some of American history and failing to recognize the Jewish contribution throughout America and going back to the very early stages. Without Jews, there would be no America. And that's in the more contemporary sense from 250 years ago. All right, our next story, and this is from Eric Dougherty on X. There's a 50-second clip. This is from yesterday, 3:56 p.m. Breaking, President Trump just said Iran is going to end up only a short-term excursion after saying it is almost complete. Short-term. Okay. Now, short-term obviously doesn't mean years. It doesn't mean a repeat of the 2003 Iraq War. Short-term probably means a number of weeks, probably a number of months. That's what I would estimate. But one of the things I hope we are all praying for, while we would like to see the Islamic Republic replaced with some kind of constitutional monarchy or a democratic republic, we need to pray for peace, and peace means a quick, decisive end to all of this. Operation Epic Fury, quick, decisive end. Okay, from the Epic Times yesterday, March the 9th. The headline, Saudi Arabia warns Iran it will be the greatest loser if it escalates attacks. Further Iranian attacks would represent an escalation that would have an adverse impact on Iran-Saudi relations, the Saudi government warns. Now, we know, of course, Saudi Arabia, along with other Arab states, was fired back on by the Islamic Republic. There have been observations made. I mean, right now, the main players in this whole conflict are Israel and the United States. But what if Iran, in their stupidity, firing back at these different Arab countries, these different Arab states, it just hits a point where, okay, we can't tolerate this anymore. And you see countries like Saudi Arabia join the fight. And they actually end up fighting alongside of, they fought alongside the United States before, but they end up fighting alongside of Israel. What is that going to do? Now, in the short term, it means that the interests of everyone coalesce and they've got shared interests. But over the long term, what does it mean for the end time scenario? Because, you can't have some kind of an end time peace treaty, covenant with many, without some sincere effort to have peace and get along. Okay, here's a big one, which has gone all over social media. I'm referencing this so you are aware that I try to keep tabs on what people in the more quote-unquote prophetic world are saying. Whether you agree or disagree is not the point. Okay, this is from Charisma, so I went right to the top. From yesterday, Donald Trump goes prophetic. The Kim Clement prophecy the president is highlighting. So on the president's platform, Truth Social, and I did confirm this, he reposted a video of Kim Clement from 2007. And here's a lot of that video right here so you can watch. There are a lot of people who are convinced that Kim Clement was a genuine prophet, that he issued words about President Trump, the United States, Israel, Iran, Iraq, etc. And I'm just here to acknowledge that I've looked through this, and just like we do with a lot of the information on the Nephilim and fallen angels, we just file this away. The prophecies we absolutely have to be concerned about are contained in the Holy Scriptures. But we know people think this kind of thing, many people think this kind of thing is very important, and we at least acknowledge that we have filed this away. Okay. Okay, we've got 10 more stories, if I counted them up properly. Okay, our next story, this is from the White House, 7:35 p.m. last night. President Trump from Truth Social saying, if Iran does anything that stops the flow of oil within the Strait of Hormuz, they will be hit by the United States of America 20 times harder than they have been hit thus far. Okay, and there's some other things which, he says, this is a gift from the United States of America to China and all those nations that heavily use the Hormuz Strait. So you can read this all in its entirety, but basically, the president is saying, stay off of the Strait of Hormuz. We know that around 20% of the world's oil and gas goes through the Strait of Hormuz, goes out to markets. Some of the main markets it goes out to are, of course, the Asian markets. The one the United States is really taking a look at is, of course, China, because China gets its energy from Iran at bargain basement prices. Okay. Here's an interesting story from CNN, of all places. You all can read this in its entirety, but the headline, Lebanon calls for direct talks with Israel, accuses Hezbollah of betraying country. Now, of course, Hezbollah, they have been supported by Iran for decades. The presence of Hezbollah has really torn apart Lebanon. Are there ever going to be direct talks between Lebanon and Israel? I don't know, but there will be a reverberating effect if the Islamic Republic falls. And this is going to be one of the big things to keep in mind. What's going to happen in Lebanon? What's going to happen elsewhere? Turkey, Iraq, the Strait of Hormuz. These are the kinds of things I know Israel is really concerned about. The U.S. is concerned about the big geopolitical elements, the Russias, the Chinas, etc. Okay, going to take a slight detour because I mentioned this yesterday, and it had to do with the types of petroleum, the types of oil. Mentioned the type of petroleum oil in Venezuela, likewise the type of oil petroleum mainly seen in Venezuela. So, excuse me, in Iran. So this is a post which came up on my newsfeed from the X channel Global Statistics. Now, here's a lot of information between United States, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. But here's the picture that came up with. So Venezuelan oil, very thick. Russian oil, not as thick. American oil and Iranian oil, much lighter. And what this means more than anything else is that the thicker the oil, the thicker the petroleum, the more refinement it takes. And it also affects the type of applications. So thicker petroleum, obviously going to be used in more industrial, more heavy machinery types of things, going to be used for fuel oil of naval vessels, whereas the thinner oil is going to be used for more automobile transportation. And then, of course, all of this, and I think this is the one thing we often don't consider, because so many of us, when we think about the oil industry, oil and gas, we only think of it in terms of the price at the pump and our cars. And then you see like a big picture of greater Los Angeles, well, the smog and everything else, and the whole climate change debate. Petroleum is used in a huge number of chemicals and things like plastics and other things which we as a planet rely on today. So even if we were to totally get off of petroleum for transportation purposes, there'd still be a definite use for all of the chemicals we use, plastics, and so many other things which require oil or petroleum as a component. Okay, here's some more about the Lebanon issue. This is from Sky News yesterday, 8:45. There's a 4-minute, 2-second clip. Breaking. Lebanon's Justice Minister Adel Nasser demands that Hezbollah be dismantled. And his statement recorded here is Hezbollah cannot continue to keep and maintain a military infrastructure within the state. So, certainly for the government of Israel, seeing regime change in Iran, the Islamic Republic gone, would mean the likely disappearance of Hezbollah as well. And then, of course, you got the Houthis down in Yemen and all these other things. Doesn't mean terrorism and Islamicism all go away. They don't. But a lot of these ongoing threats, a lot of these ongoing nuisances to Israel can dissipate. Okay, going to change gears just a little bit for Russia and Ukraine. This is from Open Source Intel Defender, yesterday, 3:05. During the call today, so Trump and Putin had a phone call yesterday between U.S. President Donald J. Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. The ongoing war in Ukraine and the current Russian operational dynamic, as dictated by Russia, was reportedly the subject of part of their conversation. This news comes after an earlier statement by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that talks on Ukraine have been sidelined due to the ongoing conflict between Iran and the U.S. Israel. Now, we know that there are other deals the president is working on. Right now, the main one is Iran. We also, of course, yesterday talked a little bit about Cuba, and Cuba was connected to the Venezuelan situation because Cuba was getting, huge numbers of its energy, its oil from Venezuela, also some economic support from Venezuela. So we got that here in the Western Hemisphere, and we got the Russian-Ukraine conflict, which still has yet to be resolved. So it's going to be a rather interesting year as we see things materialize or delayed or just continue. Okay, so a few moments ago, I referenced the story by someone who was a dispensationalist at one point and got a lot of theology from fiction books like Left Behind. Here's another post from Carrie Prejean Baller. And here she said, Saint Justin Martyr wrote to Jews in dialogue with Trypho and said, for the true spiritual Israel are we who have been led to God through this crucified Christ. And she says, now that's from the 2nd century. This is one of the earliest Christian writings outside the New Testament. The early church universally believed that the church is the continuation of Israel. Christ fulfilled the covenant, and the people of God are those united to Christ, not a political atheist nation called quote unquote Israel to manipulate and confuse Christians to blindly support them, even if it means committing a genocide. Okay, and then she goes and she quotes Galatians 3:28. She also talks about new covenant in Christ fulfills and completes the old covenant, and those who bless Christ will be blessed, meaning bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. That's ultimately Jesus. Her conclusion, don't allow the Ted Cruz heretics to manipulate and twist scripture. Now, for certain, there's a lot she has said there, in particular, noting Justin Martyr, the early to mid 2nd century, and how supersessionism or replacement theology was already beginning to have an impact. Obviously, I think Carrie Prejean Baller is a lost cause. You're not going to be able to convince her. But what are we doing as today's Messianic community? Are we taking note of this? With the generational shift, people who are exennial, millennial, Generation Z, that sort of thing, how they are not as supportive of Israel and the Jewish people as the baby boomers or into Generation X were. This is the kind of post we need to acknowledge as a road sign. Okay. Thanks to October the 7th, 2023, we're not seeing a progression in support of Israel. We're seeing a digression and a reversion to the way things were. And we have to take note of this as Messianic people, and we have to talk about it. We have to plan accordingly. We have to adjust accordingly. And sooner or later, and I know people don't want to hear this, we've invoked upon ourselves that we're the end time move of God. Sooner or later, we're going to have to become that. And it's not going to be what people want it to be. Okay, from Breitbart, and this is from yesterday. The headline, Trump says Iran war could end very soon, warns Tehran not to escalate. President Donald J. Trump said Monday, of course, this says on Instagram, it's from 11 hours ago, so 9:10. This was late at night anyway. Said Monday, the war against Iran could end very soon, arguing that U.S. and Israeli forces have devastated the regime's military capabilities while warning Tehran that any renewed aggression would trigger even harsher retaliation. So, of course, with Operation Epic Fury, it goes day to day and hour to hour, and we pray for the safety of our men and women in uniform. Pray for the safety of the Israeli Defense Forces, all of our allies and partners, and most especially all of the civilians who, the civilians are the ones who lose the most in this kind of a conflict. Okay, 3 more stories. From today, March the 10th, on Newsmax, Hegseth vows most intense day of Iran strikes. War Secretary Pete Hegseth said Tuesday that the United States was preparing for what he described as the most intense day of strikes yet in the ongoing military campaign against Iran. So this is something which changes constantly, and we pray for a decisive, quick conclusion to Epic Fury, Roaring Lion. Okay, from 2CTV. Today, March the 10th, 9:17 a.m. this morning, 3-minute, 47-second clip there. The regime announced that its newly appointed supreme leader would appear live to address the nation. Crowds gathered, cameras rolled. But instead of their leader appearing, officials brought out a framed photo and read a written message on his behalf. More than a week into the war, Mojtaba Khamenei still has not appeared publicly. Okay. Now, it is my opinion that he's probably still alive. I don't believe that he is dead, even though his father's dead, his wife's dead, a daughter apparently is dead. But what is his disposition? Is he conscious? Is he going in and out of consciousness? What is his medical condition? Was he injured? Did he have surgery? I mean, all these kinds of things. But in broad strokes, when you elect a new Ayatollah and he doesn't come out shortly thereafter to address the people, this is where a lot of people wonder who is actually running your country. And do we see a strong Islamic Republic of Iran, or do we see an Islamic Republic of Iran in some state of collapse? Of course, as I stress, situation changes day to day, hour to hour. Okay, and our last story, and this came across my social media feed on Instagram this morning. This is from Olivier Melnick, Messianic Jewish believer originally from France. He works for Chosen People Ministries, where he talks about what is collateral anti-Semitism. Now, of course, many of us are familiar with anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish activities, Jew hatred directed toward Jewish people. Okay, we're familiar with that. Of course, it takes many different forms, and it can be manifest in many different ways. But here, collateral anti-Semitism, this is a really good thing for you all to watch and listen to. What about people who are not Jewish, but who stand with the Jewish people alongside them? They stand with Israel. They stand against anti-Semitism. Guess what? You think that they aren't going to be affected by it either? They are. And this is something I think needs to be talked about more frequently in today's Messianic community, particularly among non-Jewish believers. Now, I'm going to go back first. I'm going to mention a story from the University of Oklahoma years ago. This was in 2002. This was probably the first time I ever, as a non-Jewish believer, a non-Jewish person associated with things Jewish, things of Israel, when I first encountered some of what he described as collateral anti-Semitism. My junior year of college, I took modern Hebrew, and the first semester we met at, I forget what the name of the building, it was Gettinger Hall, I think it was, where a lot of the foreign language classes would have met. And then second semester, this would have been spring of 2002, we met on the top level of Dale Hall Tower and kind of had a view of, a big part of the University of Oklahoma campus. So it was fun. And most of the people in our modern Hebrew class were either Jewish students or they were Christian students planning to go on to some kind of ministry, Bible study, biblical studies, and they wanted a head start on learning Hebrew. And I was obviously one of them. So I remember later on one day, and I was in a different class, and it was in Dale Hall, one of the lecture halls, and talked about how the elevator for Dale Hall Tower had stopped functioning for a while. And somebody asked me, well, how do you know that? Well, I've got a class, up in Dale Hall Tower. Oh, well, what is it? Well, it's Hebrew. Are you Jewish? And the guy was, wearing, big leather jacket, kind of a bicycle, not bicycle, motorcycle, and not really skinhead, but sort of. And I could tell this was more than just, why are you taking this? Now I said, well, I'm going into biblical studies. But that was the first time I ever directly experienced something in the realm of collateral anti-Semitism, people who just don't like Jews. And certainly, as we as a ministry, Outreach Israel, Messianic Apologetics, we've been our family's been part of the Messianic community for 30 years. Over the past several years, we posted things. We've gotten some really nasty anti-Semitic comments for standing with Israel, standing with the Jewish people. We got one yesterday on one of the social media platforms. Some of these are blocked by the different tools for you to go in and look at and approve or disapprove or just, archive. But that does happen. And one of the reasons why, and this doesn't get discussed to the degree it should, and maybe it has to come from a non-Jewish person in the Messianic community. It's not something you're going to hear from anybody in one law, one Torah, or Hebrew roots for certain. Today's Messianic Judaism certainly stresses that non-Jewish believers who come into the Messianic community, they have to be called by the Lord. They have to be divinely summoned. And usually there's some unique story regarding why they're here. And they have to be like a Ruth. Of course, the famous statement by Ruth was, your people will be my people, your God, my God. But the other statement that Ruth makes at the same time, which doesn't get enough publicity, is the statement she made to Naomi, where you were buried, I will be buried. That is the kind of commitment a non-Jewish person in the Messianic community has to make. Because sooner or later, as we have begun to see over the past several years, post-October the 7th, we're seeing increasing anti-Semitism, increasing anti-Zionism, increasing Jew hatred. And yeah, even at my local congregation, there's some people who were attending who are no longer attending. Now, is it because they got a new job and they had to leave? It's because they, other circumstances, or is it because of when we are? And when we are is going to challenge the loyalty of many of the non-Jewish people in today's Messianic community. And how many are going to stay? I don't know. I mean, certainly, I believe that a non-Jewish person who has married a Jewish person, whether it's a husband or wife, well, they're committed in a way to the Messianic community and the Jewish people that many others are not committed to. But there are people, families like mine, we've been in this for 30 years. We ain't going anywhere. We are in this until the clouds break and we hear the trumpet blast, right? We're in this until all Israel will be saved. We're in this until the end. But there's some people, they come into the Messianic community. Oh, I'm being enriched by Torah study. I love Shabbat. I love the Jews. I love Israel. And then what kind of collateral anti-Semitism might they face today? This is not the 1990s anymore. It's not the 2000s. It's not even the 2010s. Are we at the same kind of anti-Semitism of 1930s Germany? I was thinking about this earlier today. And actually, what I kind of got in the spirit was no, but we might be in 1920s Germany. Oh, okay. So there's still that up and coming political party, right? And it's still trying to get its name out there and get its base of support. So I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think we do need to shift a lot of the way we look at things as though we are in 1920s Germany. And we continue to wait, we continue to see, and certainly we continue to monitor these different situations and pray for the Lord to give us wisdom and discernment to calm people down, but not avoid anything. Okay, so that concludes our news roundup for today. As I said earlier, tomorrow and Wednesday, Wednesday and Thursday, we're going to go through my article I wrote a few years ago, sorting through native, sojourner, and God's people today. So that kind of continues from what we discussed over 3 weeks, the one law, one Torah issue. Now we've discussed Micah 4, 1-3, Isaiah 2, 2-4, its importance. Now, how do we sort through things like native, sojourner, and those of us living in the post-resurrection era? That's very important because the simple yet complicated rule of biblical study: interpret a text for its original audience first, deduce principles for today. All right. As always, on behalf of Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our efforts. Please do consider signing up for a monthly $25 or $50 donation. And you can do that at our website, messianicapologetics.net. So you can do that by clicking on the donate tab. But while you're there, we have a wide array of articles, frequently asked questions entries, different back issues of Outreach Israel News. You can take a look at some back episodes of Messianic Insider, McKee Moment Shorts, and generally look into our ministry adventures from over the years. Please be sure to give this episode a thumbs up or a heart. It will help our exposure on social media. And repost this episode to your social media feeds: Facebook, X, Instagram. Email this to a friend. We will see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you, shalom, and take care.